The Last Bratva. Truth of the 90s. I am Sergey. I lived through it. I watched the city burn in ways most people only see in movies, and I saw men and women die for a few rubles, a nightclub, a street corner. I'm telling you now, not as a hero, not as a legend, but as someone who survived the cold streets of Moscow in the 90s. This is how people lived then. Fear was a currency. Loyalty was bought with blood. Families prayed in the shadows while bullets flew outside. Every corner, every alley held a story. Some whispered, some screamed. And every man who wanted power had to make a choice. Kill, betray, survive. I will take you inside the world that shaped me. You will see the faces of the men who ruled with violence, the chaos that reigned in the streets, and the price we all paid for survival. This is Moscow as it was. Harsh, unrelenting, and unforgettable. Welcome to the Bratva. Welcome to the truth. The winter of 1993 wrapped Moscow in ice, but the streets burned with something colder than the snow: fear. I was 22, restless, and too young to understand what kind of world I was stepping into. My neighborhood was ruled by a crew called the Solntsevskaya. Everyone knew their name, but nobody dared to say it out loud. They weren't ghosts. They were flesh and blood men, but the silence around them was louder than gunfire. I first saw them outside a small bar not far from Leninskaya Prospect. A black Mercedes pulled up, its tinted windows hiding the faces inside. The doors opened, and 3 men stepped out. Leather coats, thick gold chains, the sharp smell of imported cigarettes. They didn't look around. The street looked at them. One of them, tall with a scar running from his cheek to his jaw, flicked his cigarette into the snow and smiled like he owned the night. Maybe he did. I grew up watching my city change. The Soviet order collapsed, and in its place came something raw, something lawless. Factories shut down, stores were empty, men lined up for bread. But while ordinary people struggled, the gangs flourished. They sold protection no one could refuse, and if you didn't pay, you'd better pray. Money, power, respect, all of it was decided in smoky backrooms and dark alleys. My older cousin, Victor, was already deep in that world. He told me once, if you want to survive in Moscow now, you either pay the Bratva, or you join them. I laughed at him back then, but soon enough I understood there was no joke. The streets didn't forgive weakness. It was Victor who brought me to the Solntsevskaya's basement one night. The air was heavy with vodka, smoke, and the smell of wet concrete. Cards were on the table, stacks of rubles next to pistols that gleamed under dim lights. Men shouted, laughed, argued, their words cutting sharp like knives. And at the center of it all was Mikhail, the man they called the Wolf. His presence was heavier than the room itself. He wasn't large, but his eyes, cold, pale, unblinking, made even the toughest men lower their gaze. That night, something in me changed. I wasn't just an outsider anymore. Victor introduced me, and Mikhail gave me a long look, like he was peeling away my skin to see the bones beneath. Then he raised his glass. If he's family, he's with us. Those words sealed my fate. I didn't know then that every step deeper into the Solntsevskaya was another step away from the life I thought I'd have. In Moscow, once you shook hands with the Bratva, there was no turning back. At first, my role was small. I was the kid who fetched cigarettes, ran messages, carried envelopes no one dared to open. But even those little jobs had weight. When you carried a letter for the Solntsevskaya, it was more dangerous than carrying a gun. A wrong turn, a curious glance, and you could vanish into the cold night, never to be seen again. Victor watched me closely. He told me to keep my mouth shut, my eyes open, and never ask questions. In those days, silence was survival. The less you knew, the safer you were. But curiosity gnawed at me. Who were these men really? What deals were made in the shadows? Why did people lower their heads when they walked past our cars? The first time I saw blood on the street, it wasn't from a stranger. It was from one of us. His name was Oleg, a hothead who thought he could drink too much and mouth off to the wrong people. He didn't make it through the night. They found him in the snow behind a nightclub, his leather coat soaked crimson. The message was clear: even inside the Bratva, respect had limits, and crossing them could be your last mistake. That killing shook me. I asked Victor, "Why him?" "He was one of ours." Victor lit a cigarette, his hand steady despite the storm inside me. "That's exactly why. Discipline keeps us alive. Weakness spreads like a disease." Oleg forgot who he was. Now everyone remembers. From then on, I understood. The Bratva wasn't just a gang. It was an empire, built on fear and loyalty. To rise inside it, you had to prove yourself. My chance came one cold night outside a rundown warehouse near the river. Mikhail, the wolf, was there. He called me forward, his eyes drilling into me as always. "We'll see if you're ready," he said. 2 men were dragged into the room, their hands tied, their faces beaten raw. They were from another crew, small-time hustlers who'd stolen from our businesses. One of them pleaded in a voice trembling with desperation. "It was a mistake. We didn't know it was yours." Mikhail's voice was calm, almost gentle. "There are no mistakes in Moscow, only choices." Then he turned to me. "Sergey, show us what choice you'll make." My blood froze. Everyone was watching. Victor, silent. The soldiers of the Bratva, waiting. The wolf, testing me. A pistol was pressed into my hand, cold metal burning my skin. In that moment, I understood the truth. Joining the Bratva wasn't about loyalty or family. It was about surrendering the part of you that still believed in mercy. I raised the gun. The room was silent, except for the sound of my breath. And then the shot rang out. The echo of that gunshot lived in my head long after the room went silent. The man collapsed, his body twisting awkwardly on the cold floor, eyes still wide open as if he couldn't believe the end had come so quickly. Blood spread slowly across the concrete, mixing with the cigarette ash scattered near his feet. For a second, I couldn't move. My hand trembled, the weight of the pistol suddenly heavier than a stone. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Mikhail. He leaned close, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the fog inside me. "Now you belong to us." The others nodded, some smirked, some looked at me with the kind of respect I hadn't seen before. I wasn't just a boy running errands anymore. I had crossed the line. There was no going back. That night, as Victor and I walked back through the icy streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in me had died. The city seemed quieter, the snow falling softer, but inside my chest it was chaos. Victor finally spoke after a long silence. "You did what you had to do. Don't think about it too much. Thinking will kill you faster than a bullet." Easier said than done. But I didn't argue. From then on, my life changed quickly. I was trusted with more jobs, collecting debts, guarding shipments, making sure people remembered who really ran the streets. Moscow in the 90s was a city divided. On the surface, businessmen opened nightclubs, casinos, and car dealerships. But behind every glittering sign was the Bratva. If someone got rich, it was because the gang allowed it, or because they hadn't yet noticed. I learned the rules fast. Always watch your back. Never touch money that isn't yours. And above all, never betray the family. Weeks turned into months, and I grew harder. The fear that once clung to me was replaced by something colder, a numbness that let me walk past blood without flinching. I started wearing the same long leather coats as the older men, carrying a pistol tucked beneath my belt. At night, when we drove through the city in black Mercedes with tinted windows, I caught my reflection in the glass. I almost didn't recognize myself. But the deeper I went, the more I understood. Loyalty in the Bratva was never eternal. Men swore brotherhood over vodka, then sold each other for money the next morning. Trust was rare, and betrayal was constant. One night, I saw it with my own eyes. We were at a nightclub in the center, music pounding, women laughing, vodka pouring like water. Suddenly, the doors burst open and gunfire shredded the air. Another crew, the Chechens, stormed inside, spraying bullets. Glass shattered, bodies dropped, the smell of gunpowder mixing with perfume and alcohol. I hit the floor, pulling my pistol, adrenaline exploding in my veins. Victor was already firing back, his face twisted with rage. Men screamed, women ran. The music kept playing for a moment, as if the city itself didn't care about our war. When it was over, the floor was slick with blood. Friends, enemies, strangers, all dead together. That night, I learned the most brutal truth of Moscow's underworld. The Bratva promised power, but it also promised death. And in the end, the line between the two was razor thin. After the nightclub shooting, Moscow felt different. The city was no longer just streets and buildings to me. It was a battlefield. Every alley hid an enemy, every nightclub was a potential trap, and every handshake carried the weight of betrayal. The funerals came fast. We buried 3 of our own in the same week, each coffin lowered into frozen ground under a gray Moscow sky. Mothers wept, women dressed in black clutched their children, and the men stood silent, cigarettes burning slowly between their fingers. No one said much. Words didn't matter. In our world, silence spoke louder than prayers. The wolf, Mikhail, stood at each funeral, his face like stone. He didn't cry, didn't curse, but his eyes, cold as winter rivers, promised something darker than grief. Retaliation. And soon enough, retaliation came. It started with small hits. A warehouse belonging to the Chechens went up in flames one night. A car exploded in a parking lot the next. Men disappeared, their bodies turning up weeks later in the river, bloated and unrecognizable. Each strike pulled us deeper into a cycle that had no end. I found myself on the front lines more often now. No more running errands or collecting cash. I was handed weapons, sent on drives through hostile territory, ordered to stand guard while deals were made in smoke-filled apartments. I could feel the change in me. I didn't hesitate anymore when I pulled the trigger. My hands no longer shook. But with every act of violence, I lost pieces of myself. At night, when I lay in bed, I'd stare at the ceiling and hear echoes of gunshots, see faces of men I'd never forget. Sometimes I wondered if there was still a way out. But then I remembered Victor's words. Once you're in, the only way out is in a coffin. One night, Mikhail called a meeting in the basement again. The air was thick with tension. Men crowded around the table, pistols on their laps, eyes narrowed. Mikhail spread a map of Moscow, marking territories with his thick fingers. "The Chechens think they can scare us," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any shout. "They've spilled our blood. Now we'll drown them in theirs." He turned his gaze to me. I felt it like ice pressing against my throat. "Sergey, you've proven yourself. You're not just Victor's cousin anymore. You're one of us. Tomorrow night, you ride with me." The room went silent. The older men looked at me differently now. Some with respect, some with envy, some with suspicion. Riding with the wolf meant one thing. I was no longer just a soldier. I was being pulled into the inner circle. That night, as I walked out into the frozen Moscow air, I realized my life had changed forever. I wasn't chasing survival anymore. I was chasing power. But power in Moscow always came at a price. And deep down, I feared I already knew what mine would be. We moved out after midnight. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if whole Moscow waited to see which side would blink first. Snow crusted the gutters. Steam rose from manholes like ghosts. The Mercedes idled in the dark, engine a low purr, windows black as midnight. Mikhail sat beside me, hands folded. Eyes on the street like a hunter listens to wind. Victor drove. Kostya and 2 others rode in the back, silent and ready. The rest of our team spread behind in other cars, a quiet line of predators. We didn't speak. Planning had been done days before. Hit a stash house the Chechens used to move cash and weapons, the place that fed their operations in the south. Strike fast, grab what we could, disappear before the city woke up. The map was simple. Execution would be brutal. We slid into a side street and parked under a theater awning. The night was a dark sheet, the only light from a distant lamp that made snow crystals glitter like teeth. We moved with practiced quiet, boots muffled by new-fallen snow. I had a kalash slung at my shoulder, a small pistol at my hip. The cold bit through my leather, but I barely felt it. Adrenaline was a different kind of warmth. At the gate, Mikhail signaled with a finger. 3 of us moved forward. Him, me, and Kostya. The lock went down in seconds. No fuss, just a metal whisper and a small pry. The door opened to a hallway smelling of oil and old sweat. We swallowed air and went in. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the sleep of men who thought themselves safe. Crates lined the walls, boxes of spirit, stolen electronics, a pallet of cigarettes wrapped in plastic. In the back, through a half-open door, a TV flickered in blue, some late-night show playing to an empty room. 2 guards sat with their heads bowed. One snored. They were careless, and that made them vulnerable. Mikhail walked like a shadow, his boot barely making a sound. He raised a finger, and we froze. Then, in a movement as precise as breath, he stepped forward and struck the nearest guard with the butt of his pistol. The man smacked against the concrete, startled awake, hands fumbling. I dropped in on the other, hand over his mouth as the world contracted to the smell of skin and vodka. No yelling, no alarm. That was the point. Suddenness. The plan was to be in and out before anyone could think. But plans live in daylight. In dark, when fear is thick, plans sometimes die. A third guard, a lanky kid, came around a corner, his eyes wide as he saw us. I didn't hesitate. The Kalash barked, a short stutter, a clean work. He crumpled in a heap, blood dark on white snow that had been tracked in moments before. The sound punched through me, a hand of ice on my sternum. For a heartbeat, I felt the old tremble, the ghost of my first shot, but there was no time for ghosts. We moved deeper. In a back room, a safe sat on a table, heavy and humming with promise. Mikhail knelt, fingers nimble, and in minutes the locks yielded, metal groaned and gave. Inside were envelopes fat with rubles, a handgun, and a packet of documents. The paperwork smelled like paper and danger. Names of couriers and routes spelled out in neat, cold ink. This was the heart of the Chechen supply, the ledger that fed their bloodline. Outside, a sudden scream cut the air. 2 blocks away, a car alarm wailing, a light in a window. Someone had seen the convoy, or maybe the universe decided to crack our luck. Instantly, the warehouse ceiling filled with movement. Doors blew, lights flashed. We were caught in the unplanned. Mikhail's voice was a razor. Move! He shoved envelopes into a duffel, smashed a crate to stop a rolling sound, and we sprinted for the exit. Bullets began to stitch the walls, iron against plaster. One of our men went down, a soft thud, his grip slipping from the duffel. I grabbed it without thinking, felt the blood warm and thick under gloves that were not meant for this. We bunched out onto the street, and the world erupted. Figures in black shouted. A hail of fire lit the alley like a sunrise of war. A car roared toward us and cut the road. Headlights blinded. I dropped behind the bumper of a rusting van, hearts pounding in my ears like men running a race they could not finish. Kostya returned fire with a kind of fury I'd never heard in him. Pure animal energy. He moved like a battering ram, his heavy shoulders taking hits that would have felled others. Mikhail barked orders with a voice that didn't tremble. Left now. Drive. Burn the alley. Short commands carved from steel. I followed, crawling, ducking, feeling the hot spit of bullets pass inches away, feeling the world contract to the choices under my boots. We reached the cars in a blistering scramble. Tires screeched, engines roared, and a Mercedes peeled out, spitting snow. Behind us, shouts rose, and I saw shadowed figures break into pursuit. The city was awake now, and there was no sleeping in this fight. We barreled down narrow streets, turning tight, the back of my head ringing from the close calls. I clutched the duffel to my chest as if my ribs could hold the whole thing. Money, weapons, the ledger of enemies. We lost 2 men on the run. One of them did not climb into any car. His body remained curled in the street, a dark stain, a name yet unspoken. Victor, who had been driving another car in the convoy, caught a bullet through the shoulder. His breath came ragged but steady. He swore, a string of words, and we kept going. Pain was a currency you could pay with if life was the prize. In the safe room at the restaurant, the mood was a wash of adrenaline and silence. Mikhail ripped open one envelope, and his face, usually a mask, flickered. The numbers were good. The routes were listed. Somebody on the inside was feeding us gold. It wasn't just a tactical win. It was a map. We now had names that led to money, names that led to people, names that led to leverage. But in the price ledger of this night, we had losses. Men's faces were missing from the table. Blood had been spent like cheap vodka. The ledger of our victory was balanced with names, and I felt my role as one who keeps the numbers straight and the bodies moving. Mikhail lit a cigarette, smoke curling, and looked at me as if weighing my soul. "You did well tonight," he said, breath thin in the cold. "You moved like a man." There was approval there, but no warmth. The wolf did not give warmth. He measured worth. That night I lay awake on a cot, the dulled ache in my legs a reminder of where the world began to end and where it began to harden. I thought of the kid behind the bar, of the man in the street who never climbed into a car, of Victor's pale face as he checked his shoulder. Power tasted like coins and soot and fear. It also tasted like loss. In the morning, the city's gossip did its work. The papers would call it a gang raid, the police a territorial dispute, but we knew better. The ledger we'd taken had names that would change the map of Moscow nights. And with that knowledge came new danger. The Chechens would answer, and so would the men who hid behind suits and smiles. Men who could buy justice and tip the scales with signatures. When I stepped out into the daylight, snow half melted into dirty slush. I felt older. The raid had been a step, decisive, brutal, necessary. It had made me a soldier in a war where maps were drawn in blood and deals. It had also carved deeper lines into my face, a definition by violence. And somewhere in the city, a phone would ring. Names would be whispered. The story would begin again. The winter of 1993 pressed hard against the city. Snow piled in dirty heaps along the curbs, exhaust fumes rising like steam over Moscow's frozen streets. The cold didn't stop the Bratva from gathering. Inside a basement cafe near Arbat, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the sour stench of vodka, and the muffled hum of secrets exchanged in low voices. Anton leaned back in his chair, his heavy leather coat creaking, eyes fixed on a newspaper spread across the table. The headlines screamed about corruption scandals in the mayor's office, but Anton wasn't interested in politics. He cared about the names. He traced his finger down a paragraph until it stopped on a familiar one, a businessman who owed them money. Across from him, Sasha the wolf gnawed at a toothpick, restless as always. "We should take him tonight," Sasha muttered, his voice a low growl. "The longer he hides, the weaker we look." But Anton shook his head. "No, he has connections we can use. Let him sweat a little more. Fear is better than blood, for now." The group fell silent, and in that silence, the sound of the city above seeped into the room. The distant horns, the shuffle of boots over icy sidewalks, the occasional burst of laughter from drunks. Moscow was alive, but under its skin it was bleeding, cut open by crime, greed, and betrayal. Later that night, Anton and Sasha rode in a black Volga down Kutuzovsky Prospect. The city lights smeared in the frost on the windshield, and the radio whispered a melancholy chanson ballad about prison and lost love. Sasha turned the volume up, grinning. "Music of the times," he said. They pulled up outside a gaudy new restaurant, one of those Western-style places sprouting everywhere since the borders had opened. Neon lights flickered weakly in the snow, and expensive foreign cars lined the curb. Inside, Moscow's new elite toasted to money made overnight, champagne corks popping while men like Anton decided their fate outside. When Anton stepped in, the room shifted. The businessmen at the corner table lowered their eyes, their laughter breaking off. The Bratva carried an aura that no gun could equal, the weight of violence waiting to be unleashed. Anton approached their table, slow and deliberate, Sasha close behind. "You've been late with your payments," Anton said evenly, almost politely, but his eyes were sharp as ice. "Do you think our patience is infinite?" The man stammered, cheeks red, eyes darting toward his companions as if hoping for rescue. None came. Anton leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I don't want excuses. I want respect. By the end of this week, you will pay what you owe. If you don't, we'll collect in other ways." He tapped the man's gold wristwatch, smiled coldly, and turned to leave. Sasha, on his way out, crushed the man's half-finished glass of vodka in his fist and let the shards scatter across the white tablecloth. Outside, the cold wrapped around them again, but Anton didn't flinch. "We'll remind the city who runs these streets," he said, pulling a cigarette from his coat. The government is weak. The police are hungry. This is our time. Sasha lit the cigarette for him, the flame briefly reflecting in both their eyes. And what about the other gangs? He asked. The Chechens, the Orakovo, the ones in the south? Anton exhaled smoke into the night. Let them come, he murmured. Moscow is big, but not big enough for all of us. Sooner or later, there will be war. And when it comes, we'll be the last ones standing. The snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the city. But beneath that silence, the storm was already building. The first signs of war came quietly, like whispers in the alleys. At first, it was just rumors. Merchants in the southern districts paying protection money to someone other than Anton's crew. Nightclubs being visited by strangers with accents not from Moscow. But soon, rumors became bodies. One morning, a small-time bookmaker named Victor was found slumped in his ziguli, the windshield cracked by 2 neat bullet holes. His pockets were turned inside out, his gold chain missing. Everyone in Anton's circle knew Victor belonged to them. His debt books ran through their hands. Killing him was more than murder. It was a message. Sasha burst into Anton's apartment with rage boiling in his veins. Chechens, he spat, slamming his fist on the table so hard the ashtray jumped. Only they move like this. They think they can scare us? They don't know who they're dealing with. Anton didn't answer immediately. He stood by the window, watching snowflakes drift lazily past the gray Moscow skyline. Finally he turned, his voice calm but sharp as a knife. If it is them, then they've already made their move. Now we answer. That night, the Bratva gathered in an abandoned warehouse near the river. More than 20 men sat on crates and broken chairs, vodka bottles clinking as they waited. Their eyes burned with hunger. For money, for revenge, for survival. Anton walked among them slowly, his coat brushing against the damp concrete walls. They think Moscow belongs to them, Anton began, his voice carrying in the cold space. They think they can kill one of ours and walk away. But this city bleeds for us, not for them. We built our name on fear, and now they will learn it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, fists pounding the wood. Sasha raised his glass, shouting, "Za Bratvu!" and the roar of voices echoed like thunder. Within days, the streets erupted. Car bombs, drive-by shootings, fire in the windows of nightclubs. Moscow's nights lit up with violence. Civilians whispered the word razborka, the settling of scores, like a prayer, because everyone knew stray bullets did not ask who you were. Anton's crew struck first, catching 2 Chechen enforcers outside a garage in the southeast. Their bodies were found the next morning, riddled with bullets, the snow beneath them stained crimson. But the retaliation came fast. A week later, one of Anton's closest lieutenants was ambushed on Kutuzovsky. His Mercedes flipped and burning while police stood uselessly at a distance. The city began to suffocate under fear. Even the police turned their eyes away, their pockets heavy with bribes from both sides. Politicians whispered in backrooms, choosing which gang to tolerate. The Bratva's world was unraveling, but Anton never showed fear. One evening, as he and Sasha sat in a dark booth of a half-empty bar, Sasha finally asked, "How far are we willing to go?" His hand shook slightly as he lit another cigarette. Anton stared into the smoke curling upward. "All the way," he said softly. "If Moscow burns, we burn with it. But no one will take our place." And in that moment, the city outside seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the first spark to ignite the firestorm. They called it a razborka, but razborka was a polite word for what we were about to do. An unmasking, a cleansing, a proclamation that Moscow still belonged to those who were willing to spill the most blood. The city had tilted into chaos, and every man with a pistol and a ledger felt the world could be remade by force. Anton moved like a man who had swallowed the winter whole. He stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. Meetings stacked into one another. Men with faces like flint, voices low and urgent, plans scrawled on napkins and stolen paper. Sasha became the instrument of his will. Where Anton decided, Sasha executed. The crew grew, men from the south and the north who smelled of diesel and old prisons. They came for 2 reasons. money and the chance to ride something that looked unstoppable. We decided on 3 strikes: a hit on the Chechen courier network that moved cash to their commanders, a blackout raid on an Orkhovskaya front that laundered their profits through a chain of shell companies, and a public demonstration, an explosion of force that would frighten the lesser crews into backing away. It was theater and war. To do this, Anton needed friends he could trust inside places where trust was rarely sold. He found them in surprising suits: a deputy at the municipal procurement office who had a weakness for neat bribes, a mid-level major in the local police who still remembered the bargain he'd struck when his mortgage was empty, and a clerk at a small bank who could reroute transfers for a week without tipping the auditors. They wore ties, drove sensible cars, and kept quiet. They were the new muscle, the kind that bought violence with paperwork. On the night of the strikes, Moscow held its breath. We moved out in a convoy of beaten Ladas and glistening Volgas, an absurd mix that hid our real intent: speed, numbers, and surprise. My hands were steady now. The city had taught me better than any school. I felt a strange clarity. Plans unfold, people die, and life goes on. The memory of the man behind the bar, the kid with the bottle, the nameless faces were still there, but edged into something distant. At the courier depot, we slipped through a back door that one of our clerks had left ajar. Men who had walked the routes for years never expected to be greeted by the men who collected their pay. The raid was merciless and clean. 3 quick bursts to the generator, 2 knives pressed to throats, and the ledger was ours. Names, routes, a squeal of rubber and the smell of burning paper as one of the couriers tried to set the whole place ablaze. We left them bound and gasping, and took the bags that counted, the envelopes, the currency, the little packets of phone numbers that linked the city's arteries. The Orkhovskaya hit was uglier. Their ledger lived in a dry cleaning business that doubled as a front. They'd waltzed through customs with a smirk for years while paying men who chewed their cigars and inked signatures. We infected the front, a parade of men in plain clothes who burst the safe at dawn, hands slick with the same blood that now lubricated the city. They answered with a fire that burned a whole floor of the building and killed 3 of our men. We watched the flames swallow the lobby and felt the shock of losing boys who had never wanted the larger story. The cost of terror is always other people's lives. And then the public demonstration. Anton wanted the city to remember. A car exploded in the empty lot of a nightclub famous for money laundering. Too many men gathered there, and we aimed to strip their vanity. The blast was spectacular, the headlines brutal, and the morbid curiosity of the press worked for us. For a week, the papers carried our image. The cameras traced the patterns we had carved into the night. But the price came faster than the applause. The major who had taken our envelopes blinked too slowly. The deputy who had passed paperwork without question expected more later. Promises of a place at the table that Anton had not yet been able to deliver. In this economy of favors, debts multiply like rot. Men who had once seemed solid turned into grainy images in rearview mirrors. 2 of our men took a walk on the river and did not return. A body surfaced with a mouth sewn shut in a mocking symbol. "Speak less," they'd said to us. We learned it now on both sides of the ledger. The police existed as a net you could sometimes weave fine enough to slip through, if you could pay the right man, bribe the right captain. But corrupt men have their own vendettas. Major Lebedev, once an amenable ear, realized he could use his leverage to step up, not just to collect from the gangs, but to compete. He began to play both sides, and when you draw a line through the sand of corrupt bargains, someone always digs under it. It was betrayal with a different face now. Not the hot-headed thief who sells his name for a quick ruble, but the bureaucrat who treats murder as an opportunity to climb. He leaked a raid plan to a rival crew and watched as an entire convoy was cut down in a side street. That night, the city took home 11 coffins. Children woke up without fathers. Mothers pushed away in kitchen corners. And men like us had to look in the mirror and say that this was the price of our hunger. Anton stood over the coffins and felt the old resolve harden into something colder. "We didn't lose them to the Chechens," he said quietly. "We lost them to a new kind of hunger." He meant the hunger that wore a badge and smiled. "We will burn that hunger out." We did. Not with gunfire at first, but with lists and names. We forged evidence, whispered lies into the ears of judges, bought a scandal or 2 and turned it toward the men who thought themselves untouchable. Courts are strange beasts. They eat paper first. We fed them documents doctored with boldness, then watched as entire squads found themselves reassigned, their protections evaporating like cheap perfume. But there are always limits. Money buys many things, but it does not secure the heart forever. My hands, once raw with newness, began to score with age. I watched young men step into our world like I had, bright-eyed, too sure. They carried the frenzy of the new era. Money faster, guns louder, fewer funerals to pause them. I saw them make the same mistakes we had, and the circle tightened like a noose. One night, Anton called us to the old warehouse by the river where the floorboards still remembered better days. He looked different, older, but not less sharp. There were new men around, some from our family, some purchased allies. He told us the plan. A consolidation. We were to take what mattered, make the borders clear, and hand over the rest. No more open war for small grifts. There would be a hierarchy, a corporate structure of violence. The idea made sense to men who'd had enough funerals to cure the taste for it. We could be the ones who decided which streets had life and which had death, who took the names and turned them into dividends. But the plan also had risk. Consolidation meant partnership with men who had only one language: calculation. It meant letting new faces sit at tables where blood had once been the main currency, trading loyalty for margin. Sasha grinned that night, a flat thing. "You want to be kings," he said, puffing smoke into the air. "Kings get stabbed in the back the deepest." We laughed, a brittle sound. And in that laughter there was the truth we avoided. Everyone who wears a crown learns about betrayal. The difference between old and young, between the guys with tattoos and the men in suits, is only the angle of the knife. Weeks later came a name on a paper. Someone we'd trusted in finance, the clerk at a bank who had rerouted the transfers. He'd begun skimming. Greed. Forever greedy. The ledger closed on him as quietly as a trap. A staged arrest, a photograph, a rumor. He took his own life in custody. The event splashed across tabloids masked by official press releases. A tragic end to a perpetrator. We closed the file and moved on. Moving on was the only skill that never left us. The city shifts. You must shift with it. We took control of the nightclub district, the souks, the car dealerships. We bought stakes in construction sites because construction in the 90s was the richest form of legal robbery you could imagine. Piers and warehouses became shells for the bigger operations. Money moved through concrete and steel like veins. But power is an animal with a big appetite. It demanded more cuts of the pie, more men at the table. The consolidation that promised stability also gathered enemies who had not yet had their bellies filled. The Chechens, wounded but far from dead, allied with remnants of old crews and with new men who had learned to blend bribes with bullets. The city grew hangers-on, spin doctors, media men, men who could make a scandal blow up or vanish with a whisper, and some of them were better at it than we were. It was in the spring, when the ice finally gave up and the river ran dark and fast, that we learned of the plot against Anton. A whisper, a drunk who'd been overheard in a bar, a face at a wedding that lingered too long. Small things again, the anatomy of betrayal. Anton confronted the man in a dim backroom, the same way men had confronted traitors for generations. The man we thought solid, who had signed papers, legitimate on their face, turned white as he was dragged outside. He begged, hands clasped, but the world had shifted. The law's new faces would not help him. Money had already shifted alliances to newer banks. We buried him under the riverbank, and the city took another grave. By then, I was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The nights were long, the names piled up in my mouth like stones. I had become a ledger myself, entries of people I'd loved and lost, numbers that never balanced. In quieter moments, I'd picture a life where I'd never answered Victor's call, where the market's orange seller had kept his fruit and his dignity. Those were impossible daydreams, the kind of man who has seen too much keeps like contraband. We had money, influence, and a reach that would have made older men smile with approval. Yet the city had learned, and it learned fast. Men in suits adapted, police majors shifted loyalties, and new predators grew teeth of a different shape. We survived, yes, but survival was now measured in smaller victories and longer reckonings. On the night I write this, the night when the river is a black ribbon and the city lights blur like a fever dream, I sit in the same cafe near our bot where stories began. The cigarette burns down between my fingers. The city moves on its slow, indifferent rhythm. People laugh, lovers hold hands, taxis scream past. But beneath it all, a current of memory runs like an undertow. We had carved a map into the city with our actions. Streets that meant one thing or another, names that opened doors, funerals that taught the young how to be quiet. We built fortunes and ruined families. We traded in currencies no bank ledger could measure. We were, for a while, the pulse under Moscow's skin. And like any pulse, it could stop. It would stop for some of us sooner than others. Men disappeared. Some left to live under hot suns in faraway places. Some died in potholes nobody reported on. Some were swallowed by the very institutions they thought they domesticated. Anton, he kept on. He learned the lesson every survivor must. Adapt by what cannot be stolen, and never forget the price of every favor. He smiled less now, measured his trust like bullets in a clip. Sasha changed too. The grin hardened into a straight line. We all changed. The violence became a rhythm we matched, and sometimes we forgot that it had once been a choice. The Razborka had become law of the city. Laws are crueler when men make them in basements. And while our names were still whispered and our deeds still counted, a new era was approaching. An era where suits replaced coats, where contracts replaced hits, and where the men with the loudest mouths learned to hide behind the quietest papers. We had been the authors of the old chaos. The new chaos had its own authors. Our story was only one chapter. The book would continue to be written by hands we could not always see. And yet, as the river swallowed the last light and the city whispered, I couldn't help but feel a strange, proud ache. We had made something terrible and lasting. The streets remembered. Moscow remembered. And those who walked them would always know that nights once belonged to men like us, whether they liked it or not. The summer of 1995 came heavy and wet, the kind that left Moscow's asphalt steaming after sudden rainstorms. By then, Anton's name had stretched beyond the borders of the city. He wasn't just another brigadier in the shadows. He had become something larger, the type of man politicians whispered about and journalists rode around without daring to print his name. But the higher you climbed, the more the air thinned. Rivals, once simple thugs with pistols, were now consortiums of businessmen. Men who wore ties and carried briefcases but had killers on speed dial. They didn't meet in basements or cafes anymore. They met in hotel suites, guarded by layers of loyalty bought and sold like any commodity. Anton's empire had grown. Protection rackets in the markets, nightclubs, auto imports, even construction, where the real money flowed through corrupt city contracts. On paper, it all looked legitimate, but everyone who mattered knew the truth. It was still the same blood-soaked foundation, just wearing a more polished mask. And with expansion came danger. It was in August that the first sign of betrayal struck like a knife between the ribs. A convoy carrying Anton's men was ambushed outside of Moscow, on the highway to Kaluga. They weren't hit by street rivals. The attack was surgical, professional weapons, clean execution, no survivors. The message was unmistakable. Someone inside Anton's own circle had sold them out. The funeral was thick with silence. 20 coffins, 20 mothers crying behind black veils. Anton stood there like stone, but his jaw clenched, and his eyes never left the horizon. Later, in the safe confines of his apartment, he spoke to Sasha in a voice quieter than a whisper. It wasn't the Chechens this time. It wasn't Orakovo. This was one of ours. Someone close. Sasha's eyes burned with rage. Say the word, Anton. I'll find him. I'll cut the truth out of his throat. Anton shook his head. Not yet. If we strike blindly, we'll kill the wrong man. And the traitor will watch us bleed until nothing's left. For weeks, paranoia hung over the crew. Every meeting felt tense, every look suspicious. Men who had bled together on the streets now eyed each other with quiet mistrust. The Bratva was strongest when united, but nothing split a brotherhood faster than betrayal. The truth came in the most unexpected way. One of Anton's lieutenants, a slick man named Ruslin who always wore imported Italian suits, slipped. He thought he could hide his wealth, funnel it away through Swiss accounts, but greed leaves footprints. A careless mistress bragged in a nightclub. A photograph in a newspaper showed him in a place he shouldn't have been. Anton saw it immediately. The meeting was staged as routine, a gathering in the warehouse by the river. Ruslan arrived smiling, unaware. He poured himself vodka, raised a toast, and spoke about new opportunities in the oil sector. No one answered him. The silence told him everything before Anton even spoke. "Why, Ruslan?" Anton asked, his voice even, almost tender. "You had everything. Why sell us for scraps from another man's table?" Ruslan stammered, his confidence crumbling, his hands trembling around the glass. "Anton, you don't understand. They offered protection, government contacts, money beyond." The sound of Sasha's pistol cut him off. A single shot. Ruslan slumped forward, his blood soaking into the wood floor. No one moved. No one spoke. It was done. But the damage was deeper than one traitor. The attack had exposed Anton's vulnerability. Moscow was no longer a city of scattered gangs clawing for scraps. It was becoming an empire of organized crime, and empires devour the weak. That autumn, Anton sat in his office overlooking the Moskva River, a cigar smoldering between his fingers. He spoke to me with a kind of weary honesty only men who know the truth can manage. "Do you see what we've become? We thought we were wolves, but wolves hunt for survival. We hunt for greed, and greed never ends. One day, it will consume us too." Sasha entered then, carrying fresh news. Another raid, another politician bought, another nightclub secured. He grinned, the same wild grin he had worn since the beginning. "We're still here, Anton. That's all that matters." Anton smiled faintly, but his eyes were distant, as if seeing beyond the present moment, into the inevitable future. The wars continued. More bodies, more deals in smoky backrooms, more headlines hinting at a violence the public could never fully see. The Chechens regrouped, the Orkhovskaya fought back, and new players emerged with the blessing of men in government offices. It was no longer just about guns, it was about power, politics, and who could write the rules of the new Russia. By the time 1999 came, Moscow was unrecognizable. Oligarchs ruled the skyline with glass towers, and the streets ran quieter. Not because the violence had ended, but because it had moved into boardrooms and private dachas behind tall fences. Anton remained. Older, harder, his hair streaked with gray, but still standing. Sasha, too, though his grin had long since faded into something colder. And me, I write this now, years later, as the city hums outside my window. People walk freely, unaware of the blood that paved their streets. They think the 90s are gone, that chaos has been buried. But I remember the faces, the gunfire, the betrayals, the empire built on bones. We called ourselves the Bratva, brothers, and for a time, we were kings. But kings, too, are mortal, and every empire, no matter how strong, carries the seed of its own destruction. I am Sergey, and I have told you a story of blood, power, and survival in Moscow's darkest streets. I have shown you how men became legends and how the city itself became a battlefield. You have heard of betrayal, of loyalty tested by fire, of lives bought and sold in the shadow of chaos. This is the truth of the 90s. Not the newspapers, not the movies, but the streets themselves. The men you heard about were real, the violence was real, and the choices we made left marks that no time can erase. I have walked with them, watched them rise, and seen the cost of empire. I have seen friends die for nothing more than a ledger, and I have seen ambition turn men into monsters. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of our footsteps on the frozen pavements, the whispers of deals made in smoke-filled basements, and the cries that the city never wanted to remember. This is not a story of heroes. This is a story of survival, of power, and of the truth behind the headlines. So if you want to know what life was like in the heart of Moscow's underworld, if you want to feel the fear, the greed, and the hunger that ruled our nights, stay with me. I will tell it all. Every name, every strike, every betrayal. Nothing will be hidden. Subscribe, follow, and listen, because the story of the Bratva does not end here. It lives in the streets, in the whispers, in the hearts of those who remember. And I, Sergey, am here to make sure you know the truth. The city changes, empires rise and fall, but the lessons remain. And now, they are yours.